What is up, everyone? Welcome back to the Keeping Score podcast with your two favorite hosts, Emma Aspin and Dylan Heinrich, where we cover all things North American professional sports, especially the women's side, covering the Professional Women's Hockey League, the National Women's Soccer League, and the Women's National Basketball Association. So stay tuned for what is coming up in this episode with the PWHL. We're covering all things PWHL today, and we're just going to be talking about a quick little recap of the past couple of weeks of sports.
As of right now, when we were recording this, 3 games will have been played in the PWHL this week. We're not going to be able to get every single game with, podcast recording time, so if we miss one of your favorite moments, we're very sorry. But for now, there are 3 games. First up was Toronto at Ottawa. Ottawa won that game 3-1. Scoring got started really early with Ottawa's Emily Clark, who was one of their 3 free agent signings. She scored her first goal of the season, assisted by Michaela Grant-Mentis, her third assist, and Savannah Harmon, her second assist. Toronto didn't stay down for too long, though, with a goal later in the first period at 11:08. Toronto's Brittany Howard, her first goal, assisted by Blair Turnbull to tie things up. Less than a minute later, however, Ottawa's Brianne Jenner, free agent signing, and of course the captain of Ottawa, got the tie-breaking goal, her first of the season, assisted by Amanda Boulier to put Ottawa up 2-1. Late in the third period, Ottawa ended up getting an empty net goal from Lexi Adija, assisted by Ashton Bell and Zoe Boyd to put Ottawa up once and for all. Ottawa gets the win, even though they went 0 for 2 on the power play, and they only put up 20 shots on net. A lot of it was thanks to Emmerance Mashmeyer, goaltender, who saved 30 out of 31 shots in one of the most impressive goaltender performances of the season. And Toronto, very similarly, 0 for 4 on the power play. They put up the 31 shots, but could only get 1 goal. Erica Howe, the goaltender, allowed 2 goals, but made 17 saves in her appearance.
It was a really solid game, per usual, of the PWHL. Like we mentioned last week, Toronto is a very physical team, and we actually didn't get to see that very much this week with the Toronto versus Ottawa game. Ottawa's a huge team. They've been doing really well in the league so far, and honestly, this result didn't surprise me all that much. I'd say Ottawa and Toronto right now are towards the bottom of that 6-team tier list right now, but again, this result wasn't that surprising. I mean, for being such a physical team, Toronto certainly hasn't been able to use that to their advantage. It was still an impressive result from Emmerance Mashmeyer. She is an incredible goaltender, making 30 out of 31 saves. Yeah, it was a really awesome game. And then we've got the Boston versus Ottawa game. So Ottawa played 2 back-to-backs, and it was the first, again, back-to-back in PWHL history. Boston won that game 3-2. The first goal was scored at the 8-minute mark by Alina Muller, who we're going to dive more into in today's podcast. Muller has been a huge sensation in the PWHL right now, and having that long-term national team experience is very, very evident here. So Muller made that first goal with an assist from Megan Keller on the power play, and then Boston scored again with Jamie Lee Rattray. That was her first goal, and then she was assisted by Sophie Shirley and Sydney Morin in the first period. So Boston was up 2-0 in that first period. Going into the second period, Ottawa returned, scoring in the 15th minute by Kristen Della Rovere. Probably butchering that name. Again, welcome back to Keeping Score, where we butcher people's last names because we are, in fact, not French. So Kristen scored in that second minute with an assist from Natalie Snodgrass, and again, another impressive goal. And then in the third period, Ottawa was able to tie it up 2-2 in the 3rd minute mark by Lexi Adija, who was somebody we mentioned scoring on that previous game from an empty net goal. She was assisted by Haley Skamura and Brianne Jenner on the power play again. So something notable about both of these teams is they're actually able to take advantage of those power plays, which is incredibly impressive and not something we've been able to see very much in the league so far. And then, of course, in the third period, Boston ended up winning 3-2 after the final goal from Teresa Schaffzal. She was assisted by Gigi Marvin and Alina Muller again. There's Muller making her name in history right there.
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit, but Muller, her fingerprints were all over this game. She got the opening goal, and that last play was really kickstarted by Muller. She got the steal in the offensive zone, was able to make a couple quick passes and get Ottawa out of set to lead to that quick goal. Another good game from Mashmeyer, 18 out of 19 saves. After she entered for Sandra Abstrider, excuse me, the other Ottawa goaltender. Since it was a back-to-back, you usually don't want your star goaltender playing both games. But she left late in the first period with an undisclosed injury. I have not seen any updates about that, but that's something that will likely be coming out of the Ottawa camp sometime soon. While we're talking goaltenders, Aaron Frankel of Boston, just an absolutely amazing performance, especially early on. 37 out of 39 saves, including no goals in the first two periods.
Erin Frankel is somebody we mentioned again in last week's podcast. She was a signing during that free agency period from Boston, and clearly a good one, making 37 of 39 saves and really keeping Boston toward that middle tier of the six teams. Moving on to the Montreal versus Minnesota game. This is Minnesota's first ever regulation loss, which is actually coming pretty surprising from, I would arguably say, our very unbiased support of Minnesota here. But Montreal ended up edging out the win 2-1. In the first period, Montreal scored from Laura Stacey and was assisted by Teresa Vanisova. In the fourth minute, Laura Stacey scored. In the second period, Minnesota responded from Michaela Cava. She was assisted by Liz Sheppers and Sophia Kunin. This meant the game was tied up at 1-1 going into that second period. And then in the third period, nice even scoring here. Montreal responded by Teresa Vasanova and was assisted by Maureen Murphy and Catherine Doust, who these are names you were going to be seeing again, continuing with league play. I like this score line, honestly. It keeps people on the edge of their seats. It was tied in the second period, going into the third period. One of the teams needed to make a move there, and clearly was Montreal edging out the win there.
You look at this game, and then you also look at the Ottawa Boston game from the earlier in the night. These both happened on the same day. They both ended up going down to the wire. They were tied within the last 10 minutes of the third period. This one gets solved at about the just over the 6 minute mark. The Boston one came down to the very last minute. Another thing that we saw this week were great goaltender performances. Like we mentioned, Mashmeyer in the first one, Frankel in the second. This time, it's Elaine Chuli of Montreal was able to kill off 5 Minnesota power plays with 45 of 46 saves overall. We talk a lot about Heisey, Zumwinkle, Schofield, just that potent Minnesota offense. To hold them to one goal, that's how you're going to beat them in regulation. And that's something that no one else has been able to solve except Montreal.
And I think a lot of teams going forward when they play against Minnesota are going to take into account what happened during this game because that is very, very impressive. But also, just recapping these games really quick, look at the shots on goal. An impressive amount, in my opinion. And honestly, the goaltenders have been out of their league, playing out of their minds. And it's been really awesome to see those goaltenders just showing out. And it's really nice to see, especially those free agency signings and the top draft picks going and making big names here in the PWHL.
But once we look past these initial results, again, this will probably not be the up-to-date standings if you go on your laptop and check them right now.
As of the 25th of January. So, mind you, this is not the Sunday that it is coming out on. So as of the 25th of January, Montreal is in the top, Minnesota's ranked second, Boston in third, Ottawa in fourth, New York in fifth, and then Toronto, again, as I mentioned, shockingly, in last place. They have a pretty stacked roster. So seeing Toronto at the bottom of the table right now is something that I was not at all had on my bingo card for this PWHL for inaugural season. Montreal leads the way with 3 wins, 1 loss, 2 ties, all that good stuff. They have 7 games played, with the most games played alongside Toronto with, again, 7 games played. Minnesota's in second. They have 12 points. Boston has 8. Ottawa has 8. New York has 8. And then Toronto has 5 points. So all very, very close games. And if Toronto plays their heart out for the next couple games, they could easily get back to the top of that table.
The PWHL is very interesting because, like we mentioned, the 3-2-1 point system or 3-2-1-0 point system. So, like, Montreal has 3 regulation wins for 9 points, but then they have the 1 overtime win, which gets them up to 11. Then there are 2 overtime losses, which gives them up to 13. Then the 1 regulation loss, which doesn't count for anything. So, you look at a team like both Montreal and Ottawa who are able to escape with points in losses just by taking it to that overtime period. But what really interests me about these standings is top 4 teams will make the playoffs. So at a certain point, these teams are going to have to separate themselves. And that middle section of Boston, Ottawa, New York, all with 8 points, 5 or 6 games played, that is going to be a huge proving ground. And the games between those 3 teams especially are going to be extra crucial.
With so few teams in the league, it keeps the table nice and close. Seeing everything go down right now, I have a lot of expectations for the playoffs, and I'm super excited to see what happens. Let's talk about the top point leaders. Shockingly, the top point leader right now is Alex Carpenter from New York. She has 3 goals, 5 assists, which totals to 8 total points. She was a free agency signing from New York, and honestly, all of these free agency signings that you see are going to be very crucial parts to these rosters. No surprise, coming in second for point leaders is Philippe Poulin. She's been absolutely slaying it up, per usual. We have literally nothing better to say about Marie-Philippe Poulin. She is an incredible, incredible goal scorer and leader as well. She has 6 goals and 1 assist for a total of 7 points. Ella Shelton from New York is in third place with 7 points. That's 2 goals and 5 assists. So she's kind of that playmaker that you really want to see from that New York roster with more assists than goals, and that's something I like to see quite personally.
We've got our last 2 point leaders, as we mentioned. Alina Muller from Boston got the 1 goal, 6 assists, where she's been the top playmaker for Boston all year. And then she finally cracked through and got her first goal in the Ottawa game. And then Teresa Vanisova from Montreal again, who's definitely, I haven't looked this up, but I guarantee several of those assists have gone to Poulin directly. I can just tell. 1 goal, 6 assists, 7 points. So in a very similar nature to that, as someone who's working as a primary assister. And then she did finally get her first goal, the game winner against Minnesota earlier this week. So no surprise that we're seeing a lot of the top names this week show up in the top point leaders. But I want to give a huge shout out to Alex Carpenter and Ella Shelton. I mean, we talked a lot about the actual games themselves earlier. New York didn't have a game in the past week by the time that we recorded this podcast, but they have been absolutely killing it, especially on the offensive end.
You look at Alex Carpenter and Ella Shelton, they've been making huge, huge plays for New York. And honestly, it's very shocking to see New York being at the bottom of the table here with two stellar players like Alex and Ella. Moving right along to our goal leaders, we've talked a lot about Marie-Philippe Poulin. She is the number one goal leader for the PWHL with 6 goals and 1 assist. Again, going back to the points, she has 7 points. Poulin is an amazing and stellar choice from Montreal, and not at all shocking that she has written her name in the goal leading spot here.
We talked a lot about Poulin in our last episode. We put it out on social media. It's absolutely a great way to highlight a player who is MVP, might be the MVP of the league. She might be just the most overall talented player in the PWHL. As you can see, she's the only person who is top 5 in points and top 3 in goals, being at the very top of the goal list. The goal scoring takes a huge, huge amount of talent, and Poulin has been able to showcase that. A couple of the highlights that you've been watching, it just shows her footwork, her ability to skate to open space and just put in those laser of shots. And there's no surprise that she's leading the entire league in goals.
Talk about no surprise. Moving right on to Grace Zumwinkle, that hat trick, first inaugural hat trick of the PWHL. It is absolutely no surprise that she is second in the list for goal leaders with 5 goals and 1 assist, leading for 6 points. Zumwinkle is not even someone who was picked in the first round of the draft. So it is really, really incredible to see her so far up on these lists and making such a name for herself in the league. She's another one of those players you really have to watch out for. Talk about a sniper in the league. Zumwinkle is someone who is an absolute threat in front of the goal and makes any game for a goalie a nightmare, to say the least. Moving right on to the last and final third place spot for goal leaders, we've got Jessie Eldridge. Eldridge is from PWHL New York. We've talked about her a little bit as well in last week's podcast, but Jessie Eldridge is in third place with 4 goals and 2 assists, totaling for 6 points. Eldridge is yet another one of those players who's a threat in front of the goal. Her ability to read the ice before things happen just makes her one of those players you really have to watch out for, especially as a defender in this league.
When you have players, to be fair, like Shelton and Carpenter, who will get you the puck no matter what, it takes someone who's equally talented to finish those, and that is absolutely what Jessie Eldridge can do. It's no surprise at all that she's leading this New York team in goals and really making that her staple is her finishing ability, and that's something that every single team can need, and I think that will be crucial for New York when we start getting into the thick of the season and you need those consistent producers.
Yeah, let's talk about goaltenders and then we'll take a quick break.
First one is a very familiar name, Elaine Chuli from Montreal. We mentioned her earlier, and that just outstanding performance against Minnesota, 45 out of 46 saves. and that's just been showcased already. She's only played 2 games for Montreal thus far. Teams have done a good job of splitting up goaltenders, but in those 2 games, she's won both of them in regulation and then finished with a .962 save percentage, which if you watch any hockey, usually like .93 is considered elite. So she is operating at an extremely high level.
Or Montreal being able to alternate between goaltenders. That is something that makes this Montreal squad so good, is that they have a very balanced goalie roster. That'll come up in the future games as well, especially as we get into the playoffs. Moving right along to Corinne Schroeder. She's at a .94 save percentage for PWHL New York, and she's played actually quite a few more games than Elaine Shuley. She has 3 wins under her belt and 1 loss, sadly, but that is not to discredit her at all. She still has an amazing save percentage. I mean, just under 95%.
Yeah, she's been very good. You mentioned how this New York team, it's kind of surprising to see them that low in the standings with Jesse Eldridge, Alex Carpenter, Ella Shelton, and then Corinne Schroeder, who has been their everyday goaltender. I definitely do think that they are struggling with that second goaltender, really trying to get that depth. But every time Schroeder is in net, you know that you are going to have a very good chance of winning this game. We'll go right along to the reason why Minnesota is so high. It's their tandem. Both goaltenders are within the top 4. Maddie Rooney is sitting at a .943, and Nicole Hensley is sitting at a .941. Both of them sitting above 50% in the win column. Just 2 goaltenders who are absolutely the reason why Minnesota is, I believe, the number 1 team in terms of point percentage. It is, I believe, Montreal's first in points. Minnesota is first in percentage. Just a very, very good tandem that can absolutely support the stellar offense in front of them.
Yeah, like I mentioned with Montreal, this Minnesota roster does that just a step better than Montreal with having both of their goaltenders in the top 4. Both of them are very, very, very good at their job. They're able to read the puck before it's played. They're able to see what plays are kind of happening out in the ice in front of them, and they're able to look around the people trying to block their eyes and make those incredible saves that you see.
As we saw this past week, goaltending was very, very prevalent and got a lot better from these first couple of weeks. So I'm expecting that especially to crack down in these next couple of weeks. And I think the key to winning games is going to be through those goaltenders. And we're going to talk about that on the other side of our break as to why Toronto has been struggling so much. Stay tuned.
All right, everyone, welcome back from that short little break we took. It's your 2 favorite hosts, of course. We haven't gone anywhere. We haven't done anything too crazy, except for update the microphone. Yeah, so let's start where we left off with Toronto struggling. Despite having a shockingly good roster, they haven't been able to make things happen, really. They're the only team averaging under 2 goals per game, which is still a lot of goals per game, to be honest, but that's still shocking coming from that being the lowest average in the PWHL. And then they're the only team that has allowed 3+ goals. So incredibly disappointing from Toronto. And honestly, it's kind of looking like a coaching issue to me. They have the players and they have the stars there. They have the ability to make stuff happen, but they haven't, which at this point leads me to believe it's more of the coaching than the players.
At a certain point, when we're still talking sports, there's winners and there's losers, and it's fun to talk about the winners. You kind of wish everyone could win and get the shiny gold medal, but at the end of the day, someone's going to win and someone's going to lose. Toronto has been, unfortunately, doing a lot of losing. Like we mentioned, they're the only team who's under a point per game basis. Pretty much everyone else is above that mark. I would probably agree that it's the coaching, at least to some aspect, because a lot of that is making adjustments and getting out of the gate correctly, which is something that they have absolutely struggled with. No other team has more than 3 regulation losses. Montreal's played 7 games, lost 5 of them in regulation, so hasn't been even good at taking them to overtime or trying to get some of those points. As we saw in that Ottawa game, they fell behind early and then they had 2 periods, but just couldn't get that breaking goal. Rebecca Leslie leads the team with 5 assists, so she has been doing a great job feeding her teammates. Natalie Spooner leads the team with 3 goals. Fortunately, doesn't have any assists to add on to that, but you look at the actual counting stats, they've got a couple players who are doing a pretty good job in terms of at least putting up points.
I've been seeing a lot of people, especially people who kind of went from the NHL and now are following the PWHL, everybody's kind of jokingly saying that, oh, this is just classic Toronto sports, where Toronto's never really great at anything, which is always a bummer to see, obviously, but it's kind of funny to see people bringing that comparison into the Leafs to PWHL Toronto. And also going back to the more statistical side of this Toronto team, they have the lowest goaltender save percentage in the PWHL, which is part of the reason they're not doing so great. They didn't sign any goaltenders in the free agency period, and I don't believe they signed any goaltenders in the first round of the PWHL draft. Their two goaltenders are Erica Howe and Kristen Campbell. Erica Howe has a .882 save percentage, and Kristen Campbell has a .876 save percentage. So especially if you look going back to those teams like Minnesota, where they have two goaltenders in the top four, it's really disappointing to see Toronto. So maybe it's a combination of the coaching and the goaltending. I never want to say anything bad about these teams, especially as an avid women's sports fan. I'm pro women, obviously, but someone has to say the negative things. And it looks like Toronto's just struggling with goaltending and struggling to get their feet under them. But hopefully they're able to get their act together sooner and towards the end of the season.
It's also important to note they play 24 games. We are still 7 games into this. There are goaltenders especially who go through these highs and these lows, and so hopefully, I mean, honestly, I'd rather get the lull out of the way first. And if these goaltenders can get hot, if they can find an alternative player, they can find a route to make something that works for them, if they can find a way to play a high scoring offensive game, and that's going to work. But something, I don't think it has to be changed right now, but if you go another 7 games into this and we're over halfway through and they're still very clearly at the bottom, then you got to be looking at something's wrong. At this point, it's just something to point out.
Let's move on to something a little happier, shall we say. We had a couple
Oh
comments
yeah.
on Twitter saying they better see us talking about Alina Muller, and so we of course had to deliver. We also love Alina Muller as well. So quick little shout out. Like we mentioned in the previous week's podcast, she was one of the free agency signings. She was the youngest female Olympic appearance in the Olympics in 2014 at 15 years old, and she scored the game-winning goal for the Swiss national team in the bronze medal match. It was really, really awesome to see. And so she's one of those players who, despite still being incredibly young, she has the hockey IQ of someone who's been around in a professional landscape for a really long time. Alina Mueller is an incredible player, has a lot of experience, and has a lot more time left in the league. So I could totally see her going and becoming one of those players like a Kendall Coyne Schofield or somebody along those lines. Alina Mueller is definitely someone to watch out for. And boy, have people been watching out. She led the Swiss national team to fifth place in the 2018 Olympics in Pyeongchang, and she scored 4 goals against the South Koreans. And so that was remarkable performance from Mueller. And then, of course, she was the 3-time Swiss Ice Hockey Woman of the Year in 2018, 2019, and then 2022. So she's been on the Swiss national team for a while.
Yeah, we talked a lot about her work in Europe, but she has been stateside a lot for a lot of her journey. She was spent 5 years at Northeastern University, which is of course in Boston, which makes sense why she's on the team. All 5 years they won the Hockey East title, which is a very competitive league in Division One NCAA hockey. Made the NCAA tournament every year and was the leading scorer 4 out of the 5 years and was the captain in her final year. So not only was she came in and was like immediately the point scoring leader. Like she came in and immediately started dominating. I believe she entered when she was like 18 or 19, which for a lot of players, you haven't played that high level competition. At that point, she played in the Olympics when she was 15. She scored 4 goals in an Olympic game at the age of 19. So she was not scared of the competition at all. And so she had a very, very, very successful career at Northeastern, and she was kind of able to slip into that role almost seamless.
Going straight from collegiate play into the PWHL as the third pick in the draft. She was the first European player associated with the PWHL draft. So again, bringing that international talent like we've always talked about. And it's awesome to see so many countries coming into the PWHL and being able to bring a different style of play from each country. No one plays the same. That's the special thing about international play. And apparently, the Swiss national team likes young players and likes players that can score. And she's been doing that in the league as well. And she's tied second in points and she's tied first in assists. And she is actually the younger sister of Micro Muller, who was a former NHL player who spent about 5 years in the league. So she has that generational hockey talent. Maybe it's genetics, maybe it's talent, or it's probably some of both. And she had a 3 assist game on the road against Toronto. So while she may not be leading the pack in goal scorers, she definitely is helping the goal scorers out in her assisting capabilities. Talk about being able to put the puck in the right spot at the right time. She is an incredible, incredible addition for her team in the PWHL. Yeah, I mean, Alina Muller, I have nothing better to say other than the fact that every single team that plays against her better watch out.
We talk a lot about the American players and about the Canadian players, which are a huge part of it. I mean, Ontario was a huge champion of women's hockey. Minnesota is the state of hockey. Again, they sold out the XL Energy Center very early on. There's a lot of players from the Golden Gophers, but it's great to see some more of those players, especially from Europe, who have a huge, huge talent pool in themselves. And there's no better champion for Swiss hockey, for European hockey, maybe even women's hockey in general than Alina Muller, as someone who has been around the game forever and is yet still so young. I mean, if I'm doing my math right, she's still 24, 25, which most players haven't even hit their prime at that point, which if she hits her prime and really becomes her best version at the age of 29, 28, 29, like most players, she may single-handedly run away with the PWHL by herself.
Alina Mueller is definitely one of those first player features we're super proud of to talk about because she is an incredible player and a very obvious signing for that third pick in the draft. Let's move on to our moment of the week section. This is something that we cover where something maybe that went viral or a lesser known professional women's sport we would like to cover. So, here for the moment of the week, Dylan's first moment of the week is the Professional Volleyball Federation.
Yeah, so the Professional Volleyball Federation, I've been keeping my eye on it every once in a while, is now their new professional league that they're starting up. I believe there's also another professional league that is starting up in November. So, as we've seen with the game in Nebraska outside and then the Final Four breaking the records for indoor collegiate volleyball, it is very clearly something people love to see. And so we are starting out with 7 teams currently. There is the Atlanta Vibe, the Columbus Fury, the Grand Rapids Rise, the Omaha Supernovas, the Orlando Valkyries, the San Diego Mojo, and the Vegas Thrill, which so let's just talk about those names really quick because those are some amazing names, first of all.
Talk about some awesome names. This is one thing the PWHL didn't do, and one thing I am very, very excited about for the PV8, for the PVF. I love these names. I think some of them are a little goofy, especially like the San Diego Mojo, but I mean, at least they have names, they have that branding getting right off the bat, and I'm really excited for the first games to kind of come out. I'm super excited to see the highlights on Instagram or wherever they will pop up on my feed because I'm sure they will. Yeah, the first game was the Vibe versus the Supernovas in Omaha. They had 11,624 fans. That is such a huge number for a professional women's game, let alone a professional women's volleyball game. Professional women's volleyball is doing amazing things right now, especially let's talk about that University of Nebraska Lincoln game where they held it in the football stadium and then sold it
Mhm.
out. That game, even if you didn't go to it, you saw it on your feeds, you saw it on Instagram, you saw it everywhere. I mean, it was everywhere. It was on TV too. And so I think that was just bringing a lot of attention to the women's volleyball landscape. And so I think that's why the Vibe versus Supernovas game in Omaha had so many fans.
I mean, it's a pretty good centralized location. You were bringing a bunch of people from Nebraska, and I believe that that Omaha Supernovas team is absolutely going to run the table in terms of fan base. The Supernova fan base is going to be crazy. They could call them like the Galaxy or the Astronauts, something crazy. But it was a great match too. Like, not only was it an exciting fan turnout, but they were treated to a a great match. Atlanta won the first two sets. Omaha came back with a competitive next two set wins. And then Atlanta was just able to sneak it out, winning the fifth set 15-13. This first game is available on their YouTube PVF. Just if you're not going to watch the whole thing, at least watch the final 10 minutes because it is electric. The energy in that arena is just palpable. You can cut it with a knife. It was an amazing atmosphere.
I love a reverse sweep too. Maybe it's not my favorite thing being a CSU fan because we actually lost quite a few of our volleyball games to reverse sweeps. So while I love a good reverse sweep, I didn't like it for our CSU volleyball team, but I do like it in the professional landscape because it keeps people staying for the games because they just want to find out what happens next. And so yeah, the regular season runs until May.
Out there, games aren't going to be all on YouTube, unfortunately, like the PWHL, so we're not going to cover them as much. We will definitely talk about them whenever super important things happen. They're available on, I believe it's called Stadium and Bali Live, which are both apps you can download. If you need to learn how to do that, the PVF website is very good about showing you how. If not, they're also going to be available on CBS Network or CBS Sports Network, so they will have a couple games available on national TV. So if you pay attention to that, you should be able to catch a match, at least one by the end of the year. But no worries if not. They're planning to expand pretty soon.
They are 12 to 14 teams are planning to be the final team amount. So around if I can do the math, I'm a journalism major, not a math major. I believe that's 5 to 7 new teams being added in 2025, including teams in both Dallas, Kansas City, and Indianapolis. Eventually, they said that the goal is to reach 24 to 28 total teams. So again, part of our key moments is not just something that is important in women's sports history, but something that went viral. So as we all know, Caitlin Clark, need I say more? She is arguably one of the best offensive basketball players right now, but also maybe ever. People have compared her to Diana Taurasi, and she was an incredible basketball player, 5 Olympic gold medals. She comparing Caitlin Clark to Diana Taurasi is kind of something that might seem out of left field, but isn't really. Caitlin Clark is someone who is an incredible basketball player. And I mean, you see her shooting from the half court line, so and draining threes. Something she didn't drain, though, is the performance against Ohio State, where they lost in overtime. A disappointing loss for Iowa and a very exciting win for the fans at Ohio State. So exciting that they ended up storming the court. Our lovely Caitlin Clark over here got absolutely destroyed by an Ohio State fan. She got ran over, steamrolled, if you will, by an Ohio State fan. And yeah, apparently it knocked the breath out of her, but she is okay. She is completely uninjured. Not something you always like to see, but something I do find funny is just how adamant the Iowa women's basketball team was about not storming the court, which I don't think they would have been that adamant about speaking out against it if it happened in Iowa. So a little bit of a controversial take there, if you will, but I definitely think that they were just unhappy that their star player got trucked.
I'm gonna go with the opposite. I'm gonna go agree with you and go to the opposite of Iowa. I'm so glad that Ohio State stormed the court. Like you beat the number two team in the nation, someone who is basically terrorized the Big Ten both last year and this year, and you do it in not dominant fashion, but you win the overtime game pretty handily. Shout out to I believe it's called pronounced Cootie McMahon. She is absolutely outstanding. 33 points in the performance really helped Ohio State win that one down the stretch. And you look at some of the best games that happen every year in collegiate basketball, they're upsets that end in a court storm. And sure enough, this one ends in an upset. Didn't even take a buzzer beater to do it, but everyone was able to storm the court and celebrate along with the players. It just makes a game feel so much more important. And it really sucks what happened to Caitlin Clark, especially because again, she is the biggest thing in I will say women's basketball, period. Like she is in the news cycle everywhere. She will no doubtly be the number one pick in the WNBA draft, which we will probably cover in a couple months. But at a certain point, like it's about the greater sport of women's basketball by itself, and that's a huge win for Ohio State. And so if Iowa and Ohio State match up in the Big Ten championship or even in the NCAA tournament, like the Final Four, both teams have the talent. So that will be a match that will be circled on everyone's radar moving forward.
I cannot wait to see the next time Caitlin Clark plays Ohio State because you and I both know that she is going to pop off in this match. I mean,
I mean,
yeah,
she
she
popped
was
off in the
not
first game. She had
happy.
45 points. 45 out of your team's 92. It's still like the team lost, but Caitlin Clark killed it, which I mean is not surprising to anybody. So she was
No.
there's very few that we could say about Caitlin Clark that you don't already know, but she is definitely someone that even though they didn't win the game, I'm just looking at it now. They play at the end of the regular season in Iowa City. So that game, March 3rd, that is must see television right there.
Let's move on to my second moment of the week, and then we'll take a little break before we get on into our fun segment. My second moment of the week is the NWSL schedule being announced literally during the recording of this podcast. And this is something that both the fans hate and love. They hate it because it is never announced soon enough, but they love it because it's finally announced. So the first couple games, the first game is on March 15th, and then the season goes through June, July, and then it will take a final game in November before the end of the season. That first game is going to be against Kansas City and the Portland Thorns, streamed on ABC. Then going into my favorite team, Racing Louisville versus the Orlando Pride, streamed on the new streaming platform, NWSL Plus. This is where a lot of the smaller, maybe less important games are going to be streamed, and I'm unsure as to the cost of that subscription. But yeah, some of those games will be streamed on this new streaming platform where hopefully they'll also stay there too. So if you miss a game, you'll be able to watch those games as well. The next game is the North Carolina Courage against the Houston Dash. And then we have our first reinstation of a team, the Utah Royals. The Utah Royals moved back to Kansas City to create the Kansas City Current. And now they're back again as a whole new team, the Utah Royals against the Chicago Red Stars. I'm very, very excited to see that. Then we have another expansion team with Bay Area FC against the Angel City FC. So very, very exciting stuff to see there. Two California teams, and maybe a new rivalry will stem from this. Angel City ended up finishing in the playoffs, but they didn't do terribly well throughout the entire season. I'm excited to see what Bay FC does, and honestly, I don't mind their logo. The next and final game for all of the teams in the NWSL is the new rebranded Seattle Reign FC versus the Washington Spirit. I am ecstatic about the NWSL going back to the Seattle Reign. I'm an avid Seattle sports fan. It is definitely one of my favorite teams, and I did not like the OL branding. Olympique Lyonnais is the team in France, and they ended up purchasing the Seattle Reign. Now it has been back to the original branding from this inauguration of the NWSL. And yeah, I just love the coloring, love the branding of the Seattle Reign, and I'm excited to bring that classic Seattle legacy back and kind of remove the silly little French aspect we have there. Those are the first couple games for all of the teams in the season. You can pull it up on Instagram. That's just what I'm looking at right now, to see the entire schedule in full on the NWSL Instagram.
Yeah, I want to say it's a big year for the NWSL. They just worked out that new TV deal. So as you mentioned, the first game, current Thorns, it's going to be on ABC. I'm going to do everything in my power to get to Kansas City for that game. Uh, Everything else, they've got a bunch of games on ESPN, ESPN2, CBS Sports Network. I believe it's every Friday night. They're going to have a game on Prime as well. So this is going to be something that's fairly easily accessible that everyone should be able to watch at least one NWSL game a week if you have access to pretty much basic television. So if you were able to watch the majority of the professional sports or college sports that we're talking about, you should be able to get to watch some of the NWSL stuff. And while it is kind of a shame that they don't release it until about 2 months before, that way it just gives us less time and we just get to maintain that hype and stay excited. And so as we mentioned, we're probably going to do a full NWSL talk in the next couple months, probably in the next couple weeks now that I'm looking at it. So we will continue to build that hype train up, but it'll be great to talk about some professional women's soccer on this podcast.
That has been our key moments section. We're going to take a quick break and rejoin you guys with our fun segments. All right, everyone, thank you so much for taking that quick break with us. As I mentioned, let's go ahead and dive into that fun segment. Today's fun segment is going to be talking about the PWHL expansion teams that Dylan and I want to see in the foreseeable future. 6 teams isn't nearly enough to satisfy my craving for women's sports. So, yeah, what are the teams you picked out, Dylan?
Yeah, so I can see very much what the PWHL is trying to do. They're keeping it very localized, they're keeping it very small. That's the theme that I went with. Emma, you can talk about more your perspective as well, but especially a league early on, this travel stuff, you got to keep it small, you got to keep it compact, and you got to keep it in these markets that crave hockey. You got to get fans out there, and you got to get people who love hockey. That's going to be great for the teams, it's going to be great for the players, and it's going to be even better for the fans. So for my first one, I would put a Canadian team. I would put an expansion in Halifax, which may not sound like a huge market, but you look at the Halifax Mooseheads of the juniors, they are an absolutely phenomenal team. It's a fairly big city that absolutely loves hockey. They also have a big enough pro arena. They have the NLL Halifax Thunderbirds, who is indoor lacrosse, is something that I'm personally a big fan of. They get a very rabid fan base, and I definitely think that they could support a very similar team. Would love to see some either like green branding or some orange. I think that Halifax could absolutely pull that off, and I think they would absolutely rally around having a major pro team in their market for once. And then on the American side, this is a place that used to have an NHL team that has been dying for one. Bring back hockey to Hartford. We need the PWHL Hartford now. I don't say you have to make them the Whalers, but you could make them the Whalers. I think that would be killer. I mean, you look at the area of Connecticut is such a champion for women's sports, anyways, with the UConn women's team, the Connecticut Sun of the WNBA. I think it would be an absolutely perfect fit. You're still keeping that northeastern region. And like we mentioned, this is a place that hasn't had a pro sports team outside of the Connecticut Sun in a while, and I think they would absolutely go bananas for a PWHL team.
Honestly, I love your two picks. I can totally understand wanting to keep it regionalized and localized to the Northeast. And I think that's a really good idea. I definitely want a little different than that, but we can dive into that shortly. But yeah, honestly, I don't disagree with either of your two picks, especially from the Canadian and American sides. Like, it'll make travel and branding a lot easier. My two picks, however, were drastically different. I went way on to the West Coast. I wanted to see something. I'm again, like I mentioned, I'm a very, very biased Seattle sports fan. So my two cities that I picked on the Canadian side were Vancouver, and then an American city I picked was Seattle. So two cities that are very close to each other. If they instated those two teams, granted, it would make traveling a pain in the butt for the rest of the PWHL teams. But there would also be the pre-existing rivalry between Vancouver and Seattle. It's already existing in the NHL, and honestly, the drive isn't terrible between either of those two cities either, so they could get the fans to come from Vancouver down to Seattle or vice versa. Of course, I had to pick another team because I just couldn't pick two. So my second Canadian team I picked was Calgary, and my second American team I picked was Denver. As living in Colorado right now, I would love to see another professional team in Denver. So a PWHL team that plays maybe in the Avs stadium. That would be super cool to see, I think. And maybe kind of going off of that similar branding that the Avs have, playing on something like that, that could be really cool. And then, of course, I had to pick Calgary. That is another huge hockey hub. They have an NHL team there with the Calgary Flames. I think these two cities could be a huge deal for the PWHL. It would expand the league too. I really can see the importance of keeping things localized, but I also would love to see they're called expansion teams for a reason. I would love to see an expansion of the geographically of the geography as well of this league. So by putting a team in Denver or Seattle or vice versa in Canada, that would be really cool in my opinion.
When you think back to like the olden days when the NHL was originally expanding, they did slowly kind of work their way out with like Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, St. Louis, but they did put a team in LA very quickly, and they were not super worried about the travel either. You can also do what the Pac-12 the Pac-12 scheduling does, where they go ahead and you just play the two teams right next to each other back to back or in with 1 day separation. So if you're going to go out to Vancouver, you're going to play Seattle the next day, and I think you can absolutely cut down on travel. Very similar if you even want to do like Calgary and Denver like that. I know you talk Seattle a lot, but I got to jump on the bandwagon. The Climate Pledge Arena that they have there is so sick, and I think that would be a huge, huge venue get for the PWHL.
WNBA plays there and the NHL Kraken plays there. So yeah, I would love to see a PWHL team play there as well. That kind of sums it up for this fun section. Let us know down in the comments or on Twitter, wherever you are going to see this or the clips of it. Let us know where you would want to see an expansion team. We'll move on to our conclusion of today's podcast. There are no PWHL games until next Saturday. So tomorrow's or next week's podcast will probably be a recap of this week's games. And then in 2 weeks, since we won't have any games to cover, we'll probably do an NWSL feature since the schedule just got announced and since preseason is underway. So stay tuned. Keep your ears peeled for all of that lovely stuff coming your way. The games that are coming up are going to be Minnesota at Toronto, New York at Ottawa, and Montreal at Boston. So pretty interesting games. No close rivalries in these games, but again, it's gonna be physical. It's gonna be physical and it's gonna get rowdy. So stay tuned on the YouTube or wherever you watch the PWHL games to see the results of those games.
I will give a major shout out to that New York Ottawa game because, like we mentioned, those are two teams who are both currently at 8 points. And so those are teams that are absolutely going to be fighting tooth and nail to get those points. I think that will be an amazing game in Ottawa. I also want to give Montreal Boston is a very, very good game. It's going to be hosted at Boston. That's definitely going to be it's Poulon versus Muller. Like those are two of the biggest stars of women's hockey. And I think whoever has the better game, her team's probably going to win. So those are a couple that I'm really looking forward to. And I mean, even Minnesota, Toronto. I mean, this is a team Toronto we've mentioned has been struggling. They get a chance to play at home against Minnesota, who feels as close to a powerhouse outside of maybe Montreal that we have in the league. So at the very least, if you can go ahead and take that Minnesota team to overtime, that's stealing a point in your favor, which is something Toronto needs to get better at down the stretch.
I'm excited for that Montreal-Toronto game. I really, really hope Toronto can edge out a win over Minnesota because that would be a huge, huge, huge deal for them and a much needed big win for Toronto too. On that note, I think that concludes today's episode of Keeping Score. If you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to voice them in the comments down below or add us on Twitter or even send us an email. I do keep track of the email, so don't hesitate to send us a nice, lovely note on our Gmail. Our social medias, as usual, will be in the box below our faces here. And if you have any questions, again, put them onto the Twitter. Comment down below where you guys think those expansion teams should go next.
Unless something goes horribly wrong, we'll be here week in and week out. So if all else is failing in your life, things aren't going right in your schoolwork, I know us in college is ramping up. We will try and be here every single week for you. We will be a constant.
I'm really excited to see the playoffs happen and the start of the NWSL. So on that note, thank you guys so much for listening and have a lovely rest of your week, and we'll see you guys on Sunday.